Have you ever witnessed someone who once stood at the pinnacle, celebrated by the world, only to be seen as a failure in just a few short months? Have you ever seen a crowded room where every eye once turned to one person, only to now avoid him as if he never existed? If not, then look at Richard Cole. The 52nd floor boardroom was blindingly bright under modern ceiling lights, the long glass table reflecting the tense faces of the shareholders. At the head of the table, the high-backed leather chair once reserved for the CEO of Cole Dynamics now seemed superfluous. The man sitting in it, Richard, looked like a shadow. No one greeted him. No one made eye contact. The same people who once bowed before him now whispered behind his back. He tapped his finger lightly on the table. The soft thump, thump, thump echoing, not to get their attention, but as if to remind himself that he still existed. But no one paused. They continued their discussion as if Richard were just an empty, soulless chair. "What are your thoughts on a temporary CEO replacement?" a silver-haired shareholder asked, his voice chillingly calm. A few silent nods. Some eyes darted toward Richard, then quickly looked away as if afraid of being tainted. Richard sat there, his shoulders straight, his gaze fixed forward. But inside, a hollow vortex was swirling. He remembered clearly, just 2 years ago, in this very room, his every word was transcribed like gospel, his every smile a signal for the stock to soar. Now, the name that once made people tremble had become the name that made them recoil. Have you ever had a moment where no one needed to say, "You're useless," but every gesture, every glance, every sigh said it all? If you have, please leave a comment under this video, because Richard's story might be the one you carry in your heart, but have never dared to name. Richard Cole, the name that once graced the cover of Forbes with the headline, "The Genius Leader of a New Generation." He was hailed as a testament to the brilliance of a younger class of CEOs, bold, decisive, and successful too soon. But that halo was now just shattered glass, reflecting an arrogance that had become a burden. On the large screen at the end of the room, a stark red graph plummeted day by day. Billions of dollars in market capitalization had vanished in a few quarters. The secretary's voice was dry as she read the financial report. A 27% loss in market share, 3 consecutive failed projects, an international contract terminated. No one needed to say whose fault it was. They just glanced at Richard, their eyes as cold as if they were looking at a monument slated for demolition. He took a deep breath, but the air from the vents no longer smelled of power. It was heavy, damp, with the faint, metallic scent of rust. It was the feeling of sitting in a glass coffin, watching people discuss how to bury you. Another voice, laced with acid, cut through the room. "We cannot allow this company to be driven into the ground by one man who thinks he knows everything." No name was mentioned, but every eye made it clear. The words were for him. Richard's lips curled into a stiff smile. Inside, another voice screamed, "I am the CEO. I built this empire. How dare you treat me as if I don't exist?" But he didn't say it out loud. There was a truth more painful than any accusation. He himself was no longer sure he deserved to be in that chair. His elderly father, Henry Cole, sat at the far end of the table, silent. But his gaze was sharp enough to sever Richard's spine. A look of both disappointment and contempt. The look of a man who had built an entire enterprise from nothing, now watching his son sit there like a parasite living off his father's name. If you have ever lived in someone's shadow, ever been compared, ever been pushed aside, because you made a mistake that brought others a sense of satisfaction, you will understand Richard right now. And maybe, as you listen on, you'll want to subscribe to this channel so you don't miss any stories where you might find the words you've never been able to say. Richard wasn't entirely useless. He had talent. He had ambition. But his arrogance had turned him into a man who believed his own intellect was infallible. that all advice was superfluous, and now, that very belief had crushed his career. The air in the boardroom grew as heavy as lead. A secretary walked in and placed a cup of coffee in front of him without a glance. Her soulless nod was like a sentence. "You are no longer important." Richard's eyes swept the room. They were discussing, cutting, dividing, planning his replacement. He was right there, but he was a ghost. No one needed his nod or his shake of the head. No one needed his signature or his veto. He was present, but he had been neutralized. Amidst the rustling of papers, the clicking of laptops, and the clack of heels on the stone floor, Richard felt his heart skip a beat. He clenched his fists under the table, his nails digging into his palms, until he drew blood, just to remind himself that he was still human, just to keep from vanishing right before their eyes. And then, from the darkness of his mind, a blinding question arose. Is there anyone left who truly sees me? The clock on the wall ticked, 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 each sound like a hammer blow against the heavy silence. Richard looked up at the cold rotating numbers on the screen. The red lines of the graphs were like spreading bloodstains. He tried to keep his face impassive, but deep in his eyes, anger and shame swirled like fire. "We need someone who knows how to listen," a board member said. Someone not blinded by delusions of grandeur. The scrape of a chair, the tap of a pen against a notebook, a few soft murmurs of agreement. Richard let out a dry, hoarse laugh. "Are you all discussing me right in front of me? How impressive." No one answered. That silence was crueler than 1,000 insults. His father remained at the end of the table, watching silently, as if this failure were proof of everything he had ever warned against. His lips were pressed into a thin line. He didn't need to say a word. His eyes screamed, "I told you so." You wouldn't listen. A bead of sweat trickled down Richard's temple. Even though the room was cool, it wasn't the heat of the room, but the heat of their gazes burning him. He remembered the day of his first product launch. Same room, same eyes, but back then, they had been bright with expectation. Today, they were the same eyes, but silent, cold as ice. A female shareholder twirled a pen between her fingers and asked, as if it were a casual thought, "Perhaps it's time we considered bringing in an interim CEO." Her voice was soft, but each word was a knife cut. He opened his mouth to object, then stopped. He knew that anything he said now would be dismissed as an excuse. Worse, they would use his own words to prove he'd lost control. So he sat still, letting the humiliation twist in his gut, letting their eyes continue to pierce him as if he had already become a useless piece of furniture. In the midst of the storm, Richard suddenly remembered the long hallway at headquarters, where every wall was adorned with photos of his glory days, shaking hands with heads of state, speaking at international conferences, standing on stage as the company's stock first hit $1 trillion. Those photos had once made employees walk with their heads held high. But lately, every time he walked past, he'd see a few eyes dart away, a few strange smirks. The glorious photos were now like a distorted mirror, reflecting a humiliating failure. Injustice isn't when people curse you. Injustice is when they fall silent, treating you like a passing breeze. No longer the center, no longer the leader, just an empty, forgotten space. The secretary placed another file in front of him. "No, please sign." Not even a glance. The motion was as clinical as if she were placing paper in a printer, not in front of a living, breathing man. Richard opened the file. The cold, bolded text read, "Restructuring plan. Senior management changes." He looked closer and saw that the very first line referred to his own position. His lips trembled, but his eyes were fixed on the page. Deep in his mind, a scream echoed, "I am the CEO. This is my company. How dare you write my name down like an object to be discarded?" The air thinned as if there were no oxygen. He felt his throat tighten, as if an invisible hand were squeezing it. But no one noticed. They were laughing. They were talking. They were moving on with their lives as if he wasn't there at all. If you've ever felt like you were invisible in a crowd, ever watched people laugh and talk while your heart was being crushed, then you understand Richard. And if those memories are stirring in you now, please leave a comment, not for me to hear, but for you to know that you are not alone in that silence. A voice cut through the air, this time from his own father. Son, power isn't about how much you can say. It's about whether people still want to listen. And look around, no one wants to listen to you anymore. Henry Cole's voice was dry, even, without a hint of emotion. Each word landed like a heavy stone, sinking Richard deeper into a dark abyss. Richard looked around. 40 pairs of eyes in the room, not a single spark of light for him. That feeling was worse than any business failure. It was the feeling of disappearing from the human heart. Absolute neutralization. The rhythmic tapping of a young shareholder's pen was like a clock, signaling that Richard's time was running out. He leaned forward, his voice low but audible to the entire room. We've been waiting a year for him to change, but the only thing that's changed is that the company has continued to fall. A few stifled laughs. Short, but as sharp as a razor. Richard heard them. Each one a small cut into his already tattered pride. He tried to keep his back straight, to appear indifferent, but a vein in his temple throbbed. He wanted to scream, to slam his fist on the table, to remind them that he was the one who had built Cole Dynamics from a small startup into a multi-billion-dollar corporation. But in that moment, he realized no one cared about past victories. In their eyes, he was just the current liability. Oh, a technician who had once trembled while reporting to Richard, now calmly displayed a slide on the screen, pointed directly at the failure metrics, and then glanced at him as if to say, "What are you still doing here?" No fear, no respect, just emptiness. Injustice isn't when people oppose you. Injustice is when the entire world turns its back at once, leaving you to fall with no hand to catch you. Richard turned to his father. Henry Cole still said nothing, but he tapped his fingers on the walnut table. 1 beat, 2, 3, a cold rhythm like a death sentence. And that silence was more terrifying than any accusation. His father's gaze was direct. Piercing through every layer of defense Richard tried to erect. It said everything. You brought this upon yourself. You thought you were invincible. And now, not even I can save you. Richard clenched his teeth. The metallic taste of blood filled his mouth. He had bitten his lip without realizing it. His body trembled slightly, but he remained still, because he knew that even the slightest sign of weakness would be seen as surrender. The voices around the table continued their steady, mechanical drone. We need to restructure. Loss of faith from international partners. Continued risk without new leadership. Each cold phrase tore Richard apart, leaving him sitting there, a man with no weight. In his mind, a memory suddenly surfaced. The first morning he had walked into this headquarters as CEO. Employees had lined the hallway, applauding, cheering. The flash of cameras was blinding. The proud smile he wore that day was still captured in the photograph hanging in the lobby. Now, in that same hallway, his passing was met with averted eyes. Employees huddled together, whispering behind his back. The applause of years past had turned into a chorus of sharp, bitter whispers. He wanted to punch a wall, to shatter the invisible glass that separated him from the rest of the world. But he knew that would only give them more reason to laugh. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. And then, in that chaotic moment, a strange emptiness washed over him. An emptiness so profound he could hear his own heart beating erratically in his chest. And for the first time in his life, he asked himself, what if everything I knew, everything I ever believed, was just an illusion? Have you ever sat in a crowded room and still felt like a ghost? Have you ever been pushed aside, neutralized, treated as if you no longer exist? If so, then Richard's story is probably touching a silent corner of your soul. And if that's true, perhaps you'll want to subscribe to this channel to see what happens next, because maybe, in his story, you will find yourself. Richard left the 52nd floor boardroom with his shoulders feeling as if they were weighted with stones. The automatic door closed behind him, the soft click echoing in the empty hallway like the sound of shackles locking his fate. He walked, his leather shoes tapping on the cold stone floor, each sound a hammer blow to his spirit. The hallway was lined with photos of his glory days. In the center was a picture of him smiling, shaking hands with the president at a signing ceremony. But this time, as Richard walked past, he saw two young employees. They fell silent when they saw him, glanced his way, and then immediately looked down, pretending to be busy with their phones. A small smirk appeared on one of their faces, just long enough for Richard to understand that the golden photo was now a joke in their eyes. He got into the elevator. The doors began to close. The mirror no longer reflected a powerful CEO, but a man with dark circles under his eyes, disheveled hair, and a wrinkled suit. He closed his eyes. The ding of the ground floor was like a final judgment. It was over. The Cole mansion sat on a hill on the outskirts of the city. The house was as magnificent as a palace. Heavy iron gates, a sprawling green lawn, a line of luxury cars. But to Richard, every wall of this place felt like a prison. In the vast living room, Henry Cole sat in an armchair, a glass of whiskey in his hand, his eyes fixed on the financial news on television. The old man had once been praised as the old tiger of Wall Street, a self-made man who had built his empire from the ground up. He didn't look up when Richard walked in. Only when the butler placed a glass of water in front of his son did Henry speak. "Did you fail again?" It wasn't a question. It was a verdict. Richard clenched his teeth. "I didn't fail. It just didn't meet expectations." Henry let out a dry, humorless laugh. "Didn't meet expectations? The company lost billions. The stock is in free fall, and people are losing their jobs. If that's not failure, then I don't know what the word means." Richard wanted to argue, but his father's gaze was like a hammer blow. It was a gaze that left no room for hope. Henry took another sip of whiskey, set the glass down on the heavy oak table, and said, his voice low and firm, "You are a disgrace to the Cole name." Each word was a knife. Richard sat there, feeling as if his heart were being torn apart. Since he was a child, he had always lived in his father's shadow. He thought he had escaped it with his bold moves, his groundbreaking deals. But now, it had all crumbled, and his father didn't bother to hide his contempt. Have you ever spent your whole life trying to prove something, only to have the very person you wanted to prove it to turn around and invalidate everything? If so, please leave a comment, because maybe Richard's story is a mirror reflecting a pain you've held inside. That evening, the Cole family sat around the long dining table. His mother was silent, her eyes averted. His younger sister, a successful young lawyer, occasionally glanced at Richard, but her look was a mixture of pity and detachment. The table was laden with a lavish meal, but no one ate. The air was thick. Only the soft clink of silverware on plates could be heard. His father set down his wine glass and looked directly at Richard. "If the company were in my hands, this would not have happened." Richard gripped his fork, the metal bending slightly under the pressure. "I tried." "No," Henry interrupted. "You never tried. You were just arrogant. You thought you knew everything." That phrase, "you thought you knew everything," echoed in Richard's head like a bell. It wasn't just his father's words. It was the echo of the entire world. The media, the shareholders, the employees, they were all tearing him apart with that same phrase. The next day, the news was full of it. Arrogant CEO drives company to the brink of bankruptcy. Answered, Richard Cole, From business prodigy to symbol of failure. On social media, thousands of mocking comments and memes went viral. A picture of him on the day of a successful product launch with the caption, "When you think you're a genius but you're just a joke." Richard sat in his car, scrolling through his phone, feeling as if every word was a knife plunging deeper. He wanted to fight back, to scream, "You don't understand. I had my reasons. I'm not an idiot." But no one out there wanted to listen. The driver looked at him in the rearview mirror, his eyes filled with disdain. Though he said nothing, Richard could read his thoughts. If a CEO is like this, what hope is there for the rest of us? That night, Richard sat alone in his study. The laptop screen was still on, illuminating his exhausted face. He typed a few lines to refute a news article, then deleted them. He typed a few words of explanation for his employees, then deleted those too. Every sentence fell apart before it could be sent. Outside the window, the city was still bright, the skyscrapers still standing tall. But inside Richard, everything was dark. He felt small, lost, and invisible. He buried his face in his hands, and the piercing question rose again. Is there anyone left who sees me? Have you ever felt abandoned by your family, by society, by your community? A feeling that all your past successes have suddenly become meaningless? If these words make your heart ache, perhaps you'll want to subscribe and stay, because the story doesn't end here. In the journey ahead, you might just find that even in the darkest moments, light can still find a way in. That night, Richard left the office late. The building was empty, the cold fluorescent lights casting long shadows on the tiled floor. The sound of his shoes echoed in the long hallway, mingling with the soft hiss of the ventilation system. As he passed a side lobby, he noticed a small, seemingly insignificant scene. A woman, bent over, mopping the floor. Her janitor's uniform was faded, her old shoes worn at the heels, and her graying hair was tied back in a neat bun. In her hands, the mop moved with a steady, rhythmic grace, almost like a ritual. Richard glanced over, intending to walk on. In his mind, a janitor was just part of the background like a potted plant or a trash can. But then, he heard it. A quiet, deep voice, as if she were murmuring to herself, "The only true wisdom is in knowing you know nothing." Richard froze. His shoes stopped in the middle of the hallway. He turned and looked at the woman. "What did you just say?" he asked, his voice hoarse, a mix of curiosity and annoyance. The woman looked up. Her eyes were dark, deep, and calm, with none of the timidity he was used to seeing in his hundreds of employees. She replied softly, "Nothing, sir. Just an old saying." Richard frowned. "Socrates?" She nodded. "You still remember his name, so you must have had some education." The words hit Richard like a punch to the chest. He was the CEO, a man who had stood on grand stages and debated with government ministers. Yet, in front of a janitor, he suddenly felt like a schoolboy who'd been caught. He let out a dry, bitter laugh. A janitor quoting philosophers. How interesting. She met his gaze directly. More interesting than a CEO who thinks he knows everything but understands nothing. The air froze. Richard was too stunned to speak. How many people out there would dare to speak to him like that? Even the board of directors used flowery, roundabout language. But this woman in her faded uniform dared to lay the truth bare. Richard walked away, flustered, but her words haunted him. That night, in his brightly lit room, as he sat in front of his laptop trying to draft a recovery plan, her voice echoed in his ears. More interesting than a CEO who thinks he knows everything but understands nothing. End quote. He crumpled the paper and threw it on the floor. He had never been so humiliated in his life, and yet, strangely, deep down, he knew she was right. The next day, Richard returned to the office early. The hallway was empty, but he saw her again still bent over, mopping the floor, still with that same slow, deliberate motion. He stopped. "Hey, you were talking about philosophy yesterday. Who are you?" She looked up, her eyes glinting with a sharp but calm light. "Just the janitor." "Why do you ask?" Richard frowned. "Number, you're not like a normal janitor." You've studied philosophy?" The woman set the mop aside and leaned on the handle. "I used to teach it. Philosophy, literature, management. But that was another life." Richard was stunned. "A professor? Why are you?" She cut him off. "You don't need to know. The only thing you need to know is that you are drowning, and you never really learned how to swim. Oh, if you've ever met a stranger who, with just a few words, saw through to all your weaknesses, you'll understand the shock Richard was feeling. If someone has ever said the one thing you were most afraid to hear, please leave a comment, because sometimes the truth only needs a few words to wake us up." Richard looked around. The hallway was empty, just the two of them. He slumped onto a bench against the wall and buried his head in his hands. "I've lost everything. The company. My family. My reputation. What more do you want? Do you want to mock me for your own satisfaction?" The woman shook her head. "Number, I don't want anything. But do you want to learn?" "Learn? Learn what?" Richard laughed bitterly. "I've learned it all. Management, finance, economics. I have an MBA from Harvard. What do you think I'm missing?" She stepped closer and looked him straight in the eye. "You're missing a mind that knows how to listen, a heart that knows how to see other people, and the courage to admit that you don't know." Richard was silent. In that moment, he felt strangely small, and for the first time in years, a faint glimmer appeared in his eyes. Hope. That night, as he drove home, her words still echoed in his mind. "You're missing a mind that knows how to listen, a heart that knows how to see other people." Outside, the streetlights stretched on. Inside Richard, a small crack had just opened. Have you ever had a moment where a stranger said exactly what you needed to hear, at the exact moment you were falling apart? If so, perhaps you'll want to subscribe to this channel and not miss out, because stories like this might just be the words you've been searching for but couldn't yet say. Richard sought out Evelyn the next evening. He was no longer the imperious CEO, but a lost man, still wearing a gleaming Rolex, but walking with hesitant steps. He stood before her in the empty hallway, his voice choked. I want to learn. Teach me." Evelyn set down her mop, her eyes calm but serious. "Are you sure? There are no leather armchairs here. No glory. Only a cold tile floor and the raw truth. I have nothing left to lose." "No, you have one thing left," Evelyn replied. "You have your ego, and if you don't leave it at the door, you won't learn a thing." Richard swallowed hard. 1,000 protests rose in his mind. "I am the CEO. I've lectured to thousands. I don't need to be humiliated by a janitor." But he knew. He had hit rock bottom, and perhaps the only way forward was to start again from the bottom. The next morning, Richard arrived at the company earlier than usual. No expensive suit, no tie. Just a simple shirt. He entered an old storage room where Evelyn was waiting. On a table was a blank notebook. "This is your only tool," she said, pushing it toward him. Richard picked it up and opened it to a blank page. "What do I do?" "Write. Write everything you think, you feel, you understand when you read, when you listen, when you see other people. It doesn't have to be perfect. It doesn't have to be polished. It just has to be real." Richard frowned. "Is that it?" "I've read hundreds of financial reports, thousands of pages of contracts." "Exactly," Evelyn interrupted. "You know how to read numbers, but you've never learned to read people. Today, you start learning." In the beginning, Richard wrote with frustration. The pages were filled with dry clinical sentences, as if he were drafting a report. Evelyn scanned them and shook her head. "This isn't you writing. This is the mask you wear. I'm used to writing this way. And that habit is what's killing you. Write like a human being, not like a job title." Richard clenched his teeth. He felt humiliated, being corrected like a child, but he stayed there, holding the pen, and let the words flow. "I'm scared. I'm scared. No one trusts me anymore. I'm scared. I'm useless." For the first time in years, he admitted it to himself. If you've ever had to take off your mask to look at the real person underneath, you know how heavy that feeling is. If you've ever sat before a blank page with your hands shaking, afraid to write the truth, please leave a comment, because you are probably not alone in that battle with yourself. One evening, Evelyn handed Richard an old article about an employee who had warned of risks in a project, but was dismissed by management. "Do you remember him?" Richard scanned it, frowning. "Yes. An engineer. I fired him for being negative. He was right. And if you had listened, the company wouldn't have lost billions." Richard felt his face flush. He wanted to defend himself, to say the situation was complex, that he had his reasons. But Evelyn looked him straight in the eye. "Don't make excuses. Try to listen, even when it's too late." Richard fell silent. For the first time, he imagined what might have happened if he had sat down with that engineer, asked one more question, listened for one more minute. Maybe everything would have been different. A wave of regret washed over him, bitter in his throat. Day after day, Richard arrived early and left late. He filled the notebook page by page. Evelyn would read it, make red marks, and leave questions instead of answers. "You write, 'I failed.' But who did you fail? Them or yourself? You write, 'I want to be respected,' but have you ever respected anyone else?" Each question was like a needle, piercing through Richard's armor of arrogance. Gradually, he stopped writing about the company and the stock price, and started writing about his childhood memories, his father's gaze, his fear of being abandoned. One morning, he sat in a meeting with the management team. For the first time, instead of interrupting, he listened silently as an employee presented. And to his surprise, he discovered the person had genuinely valuable ideas. He had never realized it, because before, he had been too busy proving he was right. One evening, Richard asked, "Why are you a janitor? With your mind, you deserve to be on a podium, not mopping floors." Evelyn smiled sadly. "Sometimes, the truth costs you everything. I once exposed a corruption scandal at a university. They blacklisted me, and when my husband died, I had nothing left but my knowledge. But it's okay. Mopping floors is fine, as long as I can still live with what I know." Richard was speechless. He had never met anyone so strong a person who had lost all status but still retained all her dignity. Have you ever met someone whose very existence made you re-examine yourself? If you have, perhaps you'll want to subscribe to this channel, because here, stories like that are told not to praise, but to remind us that sometimes it's the darkness that teaches us to see the light. Week after week, Richard changed. He no longer walked into a room like a king expecting his subjects to bow. He sat down, he listened, he asked questions. He started remembering the names of the security guards, greeting the people he had once considered invisible. The notebook grew thicker. Each page was a step, a scratch, a sign of growth. And the strange thing was, Richard felt lighter. The burden of being the CEO who knows everything had fallen away, revealing a man who genuinely wanted to learn. Evelyn looked at him and nodded. "Now you're beginning. Not to learn how to be a leader, but to learn how to be a person." And the rumors started one evening. A security guard happened to see Richard sitting in the storage room with Evelyn. Him, the CEO who had commanded thousands of employees, now listening intently as an old janitor explained a passage from a book. The scene was too strange not to be talked about. The next morning, the hallways were buzzing. Whispers spread from floor to floor, office to office. Is he learning from the janitor? A CEO taking advice from someone who cleans the floors. If this gets out, the shareholders will have a heart attack. Richard felt the change in their gazes. Before, they had looked at him with contempt. Now, there was mockery, as if he had not only failed in business, but had also lost his mind. In an emergency meeting, a board member slammed a file on the table. Richard, we're hearing unbelievable things. Can you confirm? What things? Richard asked, trying to keep his voice calm. That you're spending your time after hours studying with a cleaning staff member. Is it true? The air in the room grew thick. All eyes were on him. Richard sat up straight, his lips pressed together. A dozen excuses to deny it, to save face, flashed through his mind. But then, he remembered Evelyn's words. If you don't take off the mask, you won't learn anything. He took a deep breath. Yes, I'm learning from her. A dead silence fell over the room. Then, a few short, bitter laughs. Our CEO, being taught by a janitor. How amusing. Another shook his head. We lost billions just for him to go find a mentor in a supply closet. Richard heard every word like a needle prick. But he didn't take it back. That evening, Richard returned to the mansion. Henry Cole was waiting in the study, the yellow lamplight casting shadows on his old face, but his eyes were still sharp and cold. You've shamed me, Henry began, his voice low but as heavy as a hammer. Richard clenched his fists. I did nothing wrong. Nothing wrong? The entire city is talking about how you, the CEO of Cole Dynamics, are being enlightened by a janitor. Do you have any idea what a joke that makes you? Richard looked up, directly at his father. You don't understand. She's taught me more than any school ever did. Shut up. Henry slammed his glass on the table, the liquid splashing out. You've disgraced this family. I built an empire for you to protect, not for you to go groveling and learning from someone like that. Richard swallowed hard, but still said, She saw me. You never did. The room fell into a deathly silence. Henry's eyes were ice cold, as if he were looking at a strange rebel. Have you ever had to confront your own family when they believed your choices were insane? If you have, please leave a comment not to boast, but to acknowledge that we have all fought invisible battles that no one else understood. The media got involved. The rumors didn't stay within the company's walls. A tabloid quickly ran an article. Failed CEO seeks salvation from a janitor. Social media erupted. Mocking memes went viral. A picture of Richard sitting next to a mop with the caption, My new professor. Partners canceled meetings. The stock continued to slide. And in the midst of the storm, Richard felt a strange paradox. He was terrified, but at the same time, relieved. Because, for the first time, he wasn't hiding the truth. One evening, Richard sat on a plastic chair in the storage room. The neon light cast both their shadows on the tiled floor. He asked, Why don't you hide this? You know they'll mock you. Evelyn smiled faintly. I'm not hiding anything. They only see what they want to see. They see a mop, so they think that's all I am. But you have a chance to see more. Richard was silent. In her eyes, he saw something that the board, the media, and even his own father lacked. A small but real belief that he could still change. The next day, Richard walked into a board meeting. For the first time in months, he wasn't carrying a thick report or presenting a slide deck. He just placed his thick, worn notebook on the table. I'm not here to prove I'm right, he said, his voice low but firm. I'm here to learn. And if that embarrasses you, then remember, a company only dies when it no longer dares to learn. The room was stunned. A few faces were rigid. A few gazes were contemptuous. But there were also a few other looks, hesitant, as if seeing something real in him for the first time. Do you believe that sometimes being mocked is a sign that you're on the right path? If you do, perhaps you'll want to subscribe to this channel not to support me, but to keep stories that remind you that a different path always comes with a price. The media storm had barely subsided when the bad news hit. One morning, Richard walked into the office and passed the side lobby where he usually saw Evelyn mopping the floor, but the hallway was empty. Her usual mop and bucket were gone. He stopped. A bad feeling ran down his spine. Just a few minutes later, his assistant came in, her eyes hesitant, her voice barely a whisper. "They let her go, sir. The reason? Personnel restructuring." Richard stood frozen. His ears were ringing, and he couldn't hear what she was saying anymore. In his mind, there was only one thought. They took away the only person who still believed in me. That day, Richard wandered through the floors. He checked every corner. The storage rooms, the side stairwells, the old library. But he couldn't find Evelyn anywhere. The hook where she used to hang her coat was empty. The old wooden table where they had talked was now bare, except for the faint, circular stain from a coffee cup. The air felt thin. He walked through the hallways, and employees glided past, looking at him with a mixture of curiosity and contempt. Someone whispered, "He's lost his teacher, too." The CEO learned from a janitor, and now the janitor is gone. The words clung to him like mud. That night, Richard sat alone in his study. The yellow light illuminated his gaunt face. On the table, his notebook was open, but the page was blank. He picked up a pen, wrote a few words, then crossed them out, wrote again, then tore out the page. The desk was covered in crumpled paper. He wanted to call Evelyn, but he didn't have her number. He wanted to drive and find her, but he didn't know where she lived. A vast emptiness swallowed him, cold and cruel. In the silence, he could hear the wall clock, ticking, 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 each beat driving the loneliness deeper. If you have ever lost the one person who believed in you, you know how heavy that emptiness is. If you've ever sat alone at night, feeling as if the whole world has turned its back, please leave a comment, not for pity, but to acknowledge that you have walked through that darkness. The next day, the company was abuzz. A photo went viral. Evelyn leaving the main gate with a small cardboard box in her hands, containing only a few books and an old coat. Security guards flanked her, as if escorting a prisoner. The media jumped on it. CEO's janitor mentor fired without ceremony. The articles emphasized the humiliation. The woman who enlightened the CEO now vanishes as if she never existed. Richard read every line, his heart tightening. He felt ashamed for her and for himself. He hadn't been able to protect the one person who had seen him. In a meeting, a board member said mockingly, "Perhaps now you understand. This isn't a school. It's a company. And we have no room for cheap philosophies from the cleaning staff." The room let out a faint laugh. Richard sat there, his hands clenched, but he remained silent. His silence wasn't acceptance. It was because he knew that saying anything more would only gratify them. In the following days, Richard was like a ghost. He went to work, but rarely spoke. The reports continued to be in the red. The shareholders grew angrier. The employees looked at him as if they were just waiting for his replacement. Inside him, the fire that Evelyn had lit was flickering, about to go out. He felt himself reverting to the old Richard, arrogant, isolated, but this time, without the shell of confidence, only emptiness. He asked himself, did they win? Did I lose? Forever? One evening, while tidying his desk, Richard found a small slip of paper tucked into his notebook. A familiar handwriting. Learning isn't about being accepted. Learning is about no longer being afraid of being rejected. Evelyn. He sat in silence, reading it over and over. Tears welled in his eyes but didn't fall. Her words were like a small flame, illuminating a dark corner of his mind. Do you believe that sometimes a simple sentence can hold a whole life together? If you do, perhaps you'll want to subscribe to this channel not to cheer for me, but to hold on to stories that are like a rope, helping us get back up at just the right moment. Richard was still alone, but he knew Evelyn had planted a seed, and that seed, though buried under cold, hard earth, was waiting for the day to sprout. The announcement came like an unexpected blow. The company would hold its annual shareholders' meeting, where the CEO was required to present his strategy and win over investors and the media. The news spread quickly. The headlines were brutal. Will Richard Cole have the courage to take the stage? Failed CEO to deliver his final speech? Internally, people whispered, he's going to fumble. He'll lose control. This will be the end. Richard sat in his empty office, staring at his reflection. His face was gaunt, his eyes dark-ringed. He clutched his notebook, the only legacy left from Evelyn. The last page had her note taped to it. Learning isn't about being accepted. Learning is about no longer being afraid of being rejected. He whispered to himself, I will not be silent anymore. The grand hall was ablaze with light. Hundreds of shareholders, journalists, and employees filled the seats. The flash of cameras was like 1,000 tiny daggers stabbing at Richard's eyes as he walked out from the wings. He could hear the whispers from all around. Look at him. He looks like a walking corpse. I heard this will be his last speech before he's replaced. Richard's heart pounded. But instead of carrying a thick binder of reports, he held only his thick, worn-edged notebook. The announcer introduced him. The applause was sparse, lost in the vast space. He walked out, his shoes making a dry, hollow sound on the wooden stage. On the screen behind him were the words, Cole Dynamics, a new direction. But Richard knew, today, he wasn't going to talk about the company. He was going to talk about himself. Richard took a deep breath and scanned the hall. He began, his voice low but firm. You all know who I am, the failed CEO, the man who lost this company billions, the arrogant son of a legend. You have every right to think I have nothing left to say. A murmur rippled through the crowd. A few people nodded, as if thinking, at least he knows what he is. Richard paused, gripping his notebook. But today, I'm not here to defend myself. I'm here to talk about someone you've probably never seen. Someone with no shares, no seat on the board, no glossy business card. All she had was a mop. The hall stirred. There were looks of disbelief, a few mocking smirks. That's right, Richard continued. Her name was Evelyn Jackson, a janitor in this very building. You can laugh, but she taught me something that all the prestigious schools, all the billion-dollar deals, never could. That true wisdom begins when you admit you know nothing. The room fell silent. A journalist lowered his pen, stopped writing, and looked up. An old shareholder, who had been stroking his chin, froze. Richard took another step forward, his voice growing stronger. She taught me that listening is more important than commanding. That seeing people is more important than looking at numbers. That a company is only truly alive when it allows its invisible people to have a voice. He held up his notebook. These pages aren't reports. They are the things I wrote, the questions she left for me. I used to be afraid of being mocked, but now I understand. Mockery can't kill you, but silence can. Oh, a heavy silence fell. And then, the first clap came from the back of the hall. One person, then two. Then the entire room erupted. Richard bowed his head, his voice cracking but resolute. You want to know the new direction for Cole Dynamics? This isn't just a company. It will be a place where even the person who sweeps the floors can change the CEO if their words carry the truth. Because I was changed by someone like that. The entire room was on its feet. The applause was like thunder, Many faces were streaked with tears not out of pity, but because they had just witnessed something rare. A leader who dared to be vulnerable, who dared to bow before the truth. In the crowd, Richard suddenly caught sight of a familiar figure. A woman in a simple headscarf, with deep eyes and a faint, gentle smile. Evelyn. She stood silently at the back of the hall, unnoticed by anyone else, but her eyes were brighter than any spotlight. Richard gave a slight nod. She smiled back. No words were needed. He understood. She had heard, and she had seen. The media exploded. The headlines read, "CEO admits learning from a janitor and gets a standing ovation." The clip of his speech went viral, attracting millions of views in 24 hours. The mockers were still there, but for the first time, Richard didn't care. He had said what needed to be said. He had publicly honored Evelyn, and more importantly, he had seen himself. Have you ever seen the power of speaking the truth, even when you know you'll be ridiculed? If so, perhaps you'll want to subscribe to this channel because here, stories like that remind us that truth isn't about winning, but about being set free. In the glare of the lights, Richard was no longer the failed CEO. He was just a student, standing on a stage, talking about his teacher. And that was the moment he found his true power, not the power to make others silent, but the power to make them want to listen. The next day, the media no longer used the word failure as his default label. Instead, the headlines were filled with words like truth, courage, and turning point. A major news channel replayed his entire speech with the commentary. He didn't save his company with numbers, but by daring to name the invisible. Oh, but in the boardroom, the faces of the members had not softened. One of them gritted his teeth. "He's turned this company into a media circus." Another said coldly, "We'll have to see what he does next." Richard knew he had to find Evelyn. He asked around among former employees, following small clues. Finally, at an old apartment complex on the outskirts of the city, he knocked on a door. The door opened. Evelyn appeared, a cleaning cloth still in her hand, her expression surprised, but not distant. "You came all this way?" Richard nodded, his voice hoarse. "I said your name in front of everyone. But that's not enough. I want to do more." Evelyn was silent for a moment, then invited him in. The small apartment was filled with old books, sticky notes, and scrawled quotes on the walls. Richard looked around, as if he had discovered a secret library. He said, "I want to turn what you taught me into a legacy. Not just for me, but for everyone who has ever been overlooked." The idea grew over long evenings. Evelyn was hesitant at first. "I'm just a janitor. Who will believe me?" Richard replied, his eyes bright. "It's because you were a janitor that they will believe. Because truth doesn't come from a title. It comes from experience. And you have lived that truth." A few months later, the Evelyn Academy was born. Not a fancy school, but an open space in an old building, with rough wooden tables, yellow light, and a large whiteboard with the words scrawled on it. "Here, everyone can teach. Here, everyone can learn." The news spread. Some scoffed. A CEO spends billions to open a community classroom. But others came young people, factory workers, employees who had been ignored. They sat in a circle, sharing their failures, asking questions, taking notes. And Evelyn, the woman who had once mopped floors, became their guide. One evening, in the class, a young man stood up, trembling. I was fired for spilling coffee on my boss's desk. I haven't dared to dream of anything since." Evelyn looked at him, her voice warm. "You are not defined by a coffee stain. You are defined by how you clean it up and get back on your feet." Richard sat in a corner of the room, silently writing in his notebook. He realized these simple words were what he had been missing his entire life. truth from experience, not from theory. If you've ever felt you weren't good enough because of a small mistake, this young man's story might resonate with you. If you've been through that, please leave a comment. No details needed. Just a sign that you have overcome your own coffee stain. Not everyone approved. Many investors thought Richard had lost his mind. They pressured him to step down as CEO, arguing that he was turning the company into a cheap charity project. A board member said coldly in a meeting, "You can preach philosophy all you want, but this company runs on profit, not on heartwarming stories." Richard replied slowly, "Profit doesn't create itself. It comes from people, and people will die off if they no longer feel they have value. I would rather rebuild from the foundation than paint over a rotten structure." The room exploded. But this time, Richard wasn't afraid. He felt Evelyn behind him, and the faces of the students who believed in this new path. More and more people came to the academy. Some of the former employees who had scorned Evelyn now came to listen. Even some of the company's junior managers sat in the circle, taking off their ties, listening to the stories of the people they used to command. Richard realized, change doesn't come from slogans, but from the moments when people look at each other with different eyes. In the simple room, the yellow light shone on the faces of the new students. Richard sat there, no longer the failed CEO, no longer the lecturer. He was just another student, continuing to write in his notebook. Tomorrow, who will teach me? Outside, the city was still noisy. But here, the seed of a legacy was sprouting, and nothing could stop it from growing. One dreary afternoon, Richard received a short text message. "Your father wants to see you. Tonight." The old mansion. His heart sank. It had been years since his father, Henry Cole, the legendary founder, had called him personally. In the past, it had always been cold letters from lawyers or assistants. But this time, it was just a few words, as sharp as a command. Richard stood in front of the mansion. The gray stone, the tall black iron fence, the fogged-up windows. The house where he had grown up was also the place where he had learned to be afraid. He took a deep breath and walked in. Henry was already sitting in the vast living room. He held a glass of red wine, the yellow light illuminating his wrinkled face, but his eyes were still sharp and cold. No hug, no greeting, just a dry command. "Sit." Richard sat in the chair opposite him, feeling like a 10-year-old boy called in for a scolding. The air was so thick, it was hard to breathe. Henry stared at him, his voice low. "You've turned the Cole name into a joke. You stood in front of hundreds of people to brag that you learned from a janitor. Do you know how humiliating that is for me?" Richard pressed his lips together. "You may feel humiliated, but I don't. Because it's the truth." Henry let out a dry, contemptuous laugh. "The truth? The truth is you were never good enough. From childhood, you failed at every competition, every challenge. I gave you opportunities, a position, this entire company. And what did you do? You destroyed it, piece by piece." Richard clenched his fists. Evelyn's words echoed in his mind. "Don't react with anger. Reflect the truth like a mirror." He looked up. "Maybe you're right. I did fail. But have you ever asked why? You always taught me to win, but you never taught me how to get back up after I lost." Henry was silent for a moment. A flicker of confusion crossed his eyes, then vanished. He slammed his wine glass on the table, the red liquid spilling like blood. "That's just an excuse. A weak person always finds a reason." Richard stood up and stepped closer, his voice echoing in the large room. "Do you know how I grew up? Every time I failed, you didn't look at me. You looked at my report card, at the numbers. I didn't exist as a son, but as a project. You never saw me. You only saw the name Cole." His voice cracked, but he pushed on. "Evelyn was the first person who saw me, not the name, not the title, just the person. And you know what? That's what saved me. The room fell silent. Henry sat motionless, his hand trembling slightly on the arm of the chair. His eyes, for the first time in years, were no longer sharp and cold, but held a hint of emptiness. He whispered, almost to himself, I never thought of it that way. In that moment, Richard no longer saw a tyrant, but an old, tired man, imprisoned his whole life by his own ambition. Henry leaned back in his chair and sighed. He didn't apologize, didn't offer praise, but the contempt was gone from his eyes. Instead, there was a silent acknowledgement, an acknowledgement that Richard was no longer the failed boy, but a man who had found his own worth. Richard didn't expect anything more. He bowed his head and said softly, I don't need your approval. I just need you to know that I have found my way. Henry looked at him, his eyes tired, but for the first time, he didn't push him away. Do you believe that sometimes reconciliation comes not from an apology, but from a look that no longer denies you? If you do, perhaps you'll want to subscribe to this channel to hold on to those rare moments, the kind that a person hopes for just once in a lifetime. The room was still heavy, but the atmosphere had changed. No more scolding, no more absolute denial. Just two people sitting across from each other, and a silence that held more than 1,000 words. Richard walked out of the mansion, the night surrounding him. But inside, he felt lighter than ever. Not because his father had acknowledged him, but because he had learned to acknowledge himself. The city had changed. The building where Coal Dynamics was once a symbol of power now had a new floor. Not a luxurious office, but an open space with dozens of wooden tables, old bookshelves, and whiteboards covered in writing. On the glass door, the words were etched, The Evelyn Academy, where everyone can teach, where everyone can learn. Inside, young faces mixed with old. Office workers sat next to factory workers, professors next to a street vendor. They talked, took notes, and laughed. In a corner of the room, Evelyn sat quietly, slowly turning the pages of a notebook. Her face was older, but her eyes were still bright. Richard walked in, no longer in an expensive suit, just a simple shirt. He walked around, talking to small groups, taking notes in the notebook that was always with him. A young journalist came up and asked for an interview. Do you think you saved the company? Richard laughed. I didn't save the company. I just learned how to not lose myself. And when a person finds themselves, they can bring an entire organization along with them. The journalist continued. So what do you want to leave behind? Richard looked around at the faces lit up in conversation, the sound of laughter, the pens that never stopped writing. He replied slowly, Not a building, not a name. I want to leave behind a place where anyone who has ever been looked down on can stand up and teach what they know. That evening, Evelyn suddenly stood up in the middle of a class. Everyone fell silent and looked at her. I may not have much time left, but I want to say this. Never think you are small. A look, a word, a hand reached out can change a person's life. I am not a teacher. I am just a janitor. But it was because I had nothing that I was able to see everything clearly. Her voice was trembling but firm. The room was completely silent. A man stood up and applauded. Then the entire room stood up. Evelyn bowed her head, tears streaming down her face. Richard quietly wrote in his notebook, A legacy isn't what you keep, but what you give away. The Evelyn Academy grew. Other cities invited Richard and Evelyn to open new branches, but Richard refused to commercialize the model. He said, We don't need a chain of academies. We need seeds. Let every place have an Evelyn, and let every person find their own students. The international media wrote articles, From Failed CEO to Planter of Legacies. IDAR, the lessons from a janitor that are changing leadership. But to Richard, the headlines no longer mattered. What mattered was that every day, He still opened his notebook, wrote a new question, and left a blank space for an answer from someone else. It was raining. Evelyn sat by the window, listening to the sound of the rain. Richard sat beside her in silence. She turned to him and asked softly, "Do you have any regrets, Richard?" He smiled faintly. "Yes. I regret not meeting you sooner." Evelyn smiled and closed her eyes. The room was filled only with the soft patter of rain, like the final notes of a long symphony. But Richard knew this symphony would never truly end. The next day, on the whiteboard in the classroom, a new message appeared, written in a hurry. "Everyone is a teacher. Everyone is a student. Never forget." No one knew who had written it, but everyone nodded, as if it were a message Evelyn had left for them all. Richard read the words and smiled. He closed his notebook. He didn't need to write anything more. Because he knew that the notebook had passed out of his hands, it now belonged to everyone.